Okay. Hello, good afternoon to everyone. Greetings from the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, and a warm welcome to all the participants. We have registrants up to 80 from 12 countries or jurisdictions. So welcome to this first session of APMDD's Debt Justice webinar series. There will be succeeding sessions next week and the week after that. No? So my name is May Buenaventura, and I will be your moderator for this afternoon. We hope that as more people come on board, we can have a fuller discussion, but we are really pressed for time, so we need to get moving. No? So just a few reminders. These reminders are also in the chat box. Some of them, no, I will just mention here briefly to indicate your organization and country after your name. And if you wish to tweet, there are also suggested hashtags in the chat box. And maybe just to inform everyone that this webinar is going to be recorded for documentation purposes, and also to be able to share the knowledge that will be discussed here today with those who cannot attend. No? Okay, so maybe when we get to the Q&A portion in the middle part, when there's more people on board, we can have our group photo. So without further ado, let's start. So you may have noticed how the issue of debt has become really, a burning issue of the day. It's discussed in the UN, discussed by the international financial institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and the group of the 20 largest economies, the G20, and the 7 of the richest among them, the G7. But in all these platforms and arenas, we do not hear the voices of millions of people who are suffering from the pandemic and the multiple crises of public health, economic recession, and climate change. And these are the very people in whose name governments borrow and use public money for debt service payments. What is the meaning of the long-standing demand for debt justice? So today we have, I'm really happy to welcome them as well, that we have this excellent lineup of speakers who will share with us their insights on the so-called debt problem, touching on its historical, socio-economic, political, ecological, and gender dimensions. It is our hope that a major takeaway from this session will be a southern grounding or framing with which to view, understand, and most importantly, act on the issue of debt. So our first speaker really needs no introduction. She's the coordinator of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, Lidy Nacpil. Lids?
Yeah. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us in this first of a series of webinars, as May has already mentioned. My role this afternoon is to provide an overview of what has been our framework and perspectives in understanding the problem of debt, and also of what should be the just and lasting solutions of debt, contrary to what has been the response of governments, of international creditors, both public and private. So without further ado, I'd like to share the slides for my presentation. So I hope we're beginning the screen share now. Okay. So when we say we're looking at it from the perspective of Southern movements, we're really looking at it from the perspective of peoples who are actually the most impacted by the debt problem. And those are our people and communities in the South. But also we must remember that some of the peoples from some northern countries have not been spared from this problem, because we know that since a few years ago, the debt problem has also been quite experienced by people from Greece, from Portugal, from Spain, and other countries in the north who have also undergone what the creditors call severe debt distress or severe problems. And we hope to share these views with people everywhere because we feel that there's a lot to learn from all of our experiences. So the first point that May has already mentioned is, of course, at this time, there has been a lot of focus on the problem of huge debts of southern governments. And this is a problem, of course, that is not just recent. It has plagued most countries in the South for many, many decades. When we became debt activists in the 80s, no? We've come to know the debt through what was called the global debt crisis in the 80s, because the Philippines was one of those countries hit by this so-called debt crisis, global debt crisis. It's very important for us to understand the history and systemic roots of the debt problem in order to pursue fair, just, and system-changing solutions. So I'm going to begin with a little bit of history and the systemic roots. The debt problem is actually a legacy of colonization for many countries. We've done a bit of research on this back in the 90s, and we saw that for many countries, including in the Philippines, the first lenders were our colonizers. So it's also not an accident or a coincidence that till today, a lot of the debts, a big chunk of the debts owed by southern countries are to their former colonizers, or still the same countries, governments that have been dominating our economy since we were first colonized. But it's also a problem, which is a legacy again of colonization, of continuing unjust, unequal economic and political relations across countries, including financial relations and transactions such as in lending and borrowing. But this is not just in the international context. We have to take a closer look as well on the structures and orientation of our domestic economies in the South. No? The structure and orientation of our economies are actually leading to a net outflow of wealth from South to North. No? There's an Indonesian colleague that that said as a reminder, we cannot be actually called poor countries because our countries are rich with many things, including rich with people like us, but it is a process of impoverishment that we have been experiencing because the way our economies are structured is that wealth is driving or flowing from us to the north, which includes through the plunder of our resources, the exploitation of our labor, and this is with complicity from our domestic elites. Of course, we also need to take note specific agendas of lenders and investors. They push finance capital to make profits through interest payments. They use debt and access to credit to impose conditions that will be beneficial for their interests, including promoting neoliberal policies and more lending. They use debt to create and credits to create markets for their products. So one of the terms that is important to remember is the term supply-driven lending. There's a big point made about, it's the lack of capital in the South that's pushing our governments to borrow, but we cannot forget that there's a lot of push for the South to borrow that's coming from the lenders and investors themselves. We also have to take note of the nature and logic of the international financial system and of finance capital and finance capitalists. No? There's a huge process taking place now called financialization, when the international financial system is really taking over even the real economy. It's playing now a very much dominant role, and therefore debt and debt instruments like bonds and securities are invading economies and various sectors of economies everywhere. And then we're not absolving our southern governments. They too play a part, not just in terms of the agenda of domestic elites that control many southern governments or dominate many southern governments. There is also, of course, rampant corruption and corrupt authoritarianism, cronyism, and other problems. Of course, we know from the 70s, as debts of the southern countries grew, more loans were offered. This is very typical, and it's still happening today. And the vicious cycle of borrowing to repay loans started. So this is now the cycle that's being mentioned, when it is not just borrowing in order to spend on what the governments think we need, it is also borrowing in order to be able to pay loans. The debt crisis or debt distress in mainstream discourse defines debt crisis and debt distress from the point of view of creditors or lenders. When countries are in danger of not being able to meet debt payments, or they're actually no longer able to pay in full or on time. So this is how it's defined. So when they say there's now a debt crisis or several countries are in debt distress, they're actually referring to the ability to pay or the actual payment that's being made to debt. But we must reject this definition and define debt crisis and debt distress from the point of view of people and communities the burden of debt impacts and injustices are affected the most, and who are being made to pay for these debts, not just in terms of people's money or public funds, but more importantly in terms of their livelihoods, their health, their safety, and their very lives. What is the most obvious and popularly understood dimension of the debt problem is that debt payments have taken a huge share of public resources and have been prioritized by governments over health, education, housing, and other services. So this is a very important dimension of debt, and it is actually the most popularly and widely understood. But the impact of policy conditionalities accompanying loans has been, and is as harmful, if not more so, than the impacts of debt service themselves, such as, for instance, tight austerity measures involving fiscal and monetary policies, privatization of essential services, trade liberalization, currency and capital accounts liberalization, to mention just a few. So in the Philippines, we're not a stranger to this. Conditionalities have affected our lives since the 80s, and the practice of imposing conditionalities using debt, using access to credit, and using debt relief continues today. Debt movements, of course, have also pointed out that there is also the problem of illegitimate debt. So first, the impacts of debt payments. Second, the impact of conditionalities. And now the problem of illegitimate debt. We consider these debts as illegitimate because they have been contracted in our name and are being paid with the use of our money, public funds. But we refuse to see this as our debts because of the following. First, many of them have not at all benefited people and communities and have in fact been used to finance harmful projects like fossil fuel projects, to mention one. Debts, these are debts which have violated democratic processes and laws. These are debts, many of them are debts of private corporations, but assumed as public liabilities. And also including debts which have come with highly onerous and unfair terms and conditions. So we also underscore that the world should not forget the problem of illegitimate debts. All of these are part of the major reasons why debt is contributing to deepening inequality and injustice, and why we are saddled with underfinanced and highly inadequate health systems and essential services, realities that have made the COVID-19 pandemic the accompanying debt crisis, economic crisis, and added to that the climate crisis, even more devastating. The COVID pandemic has led to debt relief initiatives from lenders or creditors, but unfortunately, these offers are similar to major debt relief initiatives of creditors in the last 2 decades, like the HIPIC or Enhanced HIPIC and MDRI. These debt relief measures, past and present, fail to provide significant relief and even much less touch on the structural changes needed to address the debt problem at its roots and provide just and enduring solutions. So just taking a look at the current debt relief initiatives of the IMF and the G20, they are nowhere near what is urgently needed by developing countries. So they make a big fuss that they have these debt relief initiatives. And these are the following critical interrelated issues that we need to challenge in these initiatives. First, too few countries are covered, with the so-called middle income countries effectively shut out. And the majority, in fact, of the world's poor are in these so-called middle income countries. They carry the bulk of debt burdens of southern countries. Second, not all lenders and public external debts are covered. Multilateral debts are not covered. So debts from the World Bank or from the ADB is not included in these debt relief measures. And participation of private lenders who hold a bulk of this external debt is voluntary and merely encouraged. Third, too little amounts compared to the scale of need. Cancellation of payments and the suspension of payments of bilateral debts over a limited period of time only, and only for a limited set of eligible countries. They do not amount to much. Fourth, suspension is relief that comes with a steep price. So the G20 initiatives, the DSSI and the Common Framework on Debt Relief, these initiatives come with a steep price because it's only talking about suspension. When the period of suspension of debt payments is over, countries will have to deal with the staggering problem of paying the backlog plus paying the regularly due amounts for outstanding debts, plus additional payments for new COVID loans. Then fifth, debt sustainability framework that is used in these debt relief measures is too narrow and comes with deeply problematic and false assumptions and assertions regarding sustainability, including the non-recognition of the problem of illegitimate debt. So all of these are the problems with these current debt relief measures. And in the meantime, southern countries will be facing even greater debt burdens in these coming years, stemming from the huge increases in international finance flows in the form of loans and other debt-creating instruments as part of the so-called fiscal responses to COVID and the other crises. So what we are pushing for are lasting and just solutions. The multiple crises we are facing today offers opportunities for us to renew our efforts. Thus this webinar series, because we're calling on everybody that we need to renew our efforts and scale up our efforts on this issue. Efforts that will be calling for these lasting and just solutions, not of course those which offer immediate relief, but those which will also address the roots of the problem. So just to state just three major points about these lasting and just solutions. Of course, the first, debt cancellation is urgently needed to free up public resources for urgently needed public goods and services, especially in the face of the health pandemic and its economic fallout, which made life much worse for billions already living in poverty, and of course, the worsening climate crisis, and to also address the injustice of illegitimate debt. But debt cancellation should also be used, the funds freed up from the debt should also be used to provide space to help pave the way for more strategic and structural reforms in the economies of southern countries, to stop the constant bleeding and borrowing, and to build strong, equitable, gender just, and sustainable economies. So our debt agenda is not just about debt cancellation. We are also pushing for resolving debts in order to pave the way for more strategic and structural reforms in our economies. And finally, we need a global systemic change or changes. These changes must also take place in the policies and practices of international lending and borrowing, and more broadly in the larger, inequitable, and exploitative economic and financial relations across countries. And just to leave you with a final word, we always like to remind people these financial debts are so tiny compared to what is owed us, the people of the South, the social, historical, ecological, and economic debts that they owe us, the North, the international lenders, elites, domestic and international, that have plundered our resources, exploited our labor for centuries. And that we need to remember that we, as many of us in Jubilee South remember, we are the creditors of this huge debt. What we are being made to pay is small compared to what is actually owed us, including climate debt, which is also part of that larger ecological debt. Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of you. And let's stay around for all the speakers because our colleagues will have very, very rich experiences and insights to share. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lidy. From Lidy, I really got that sharp lens, understanding the ideological divide of why everybody is talking about debt, but when it comes to solutions, the paths really diverge. They really separate. And so, from our experiences from the South, we want our path, our solutions to the debt problem. So we're now going to open the floor briefly for some questions. If there's anyone who wants to ask Lidy anything or clarify anything, you can also write it in the chat box and we can address those questions.
Hi, thank you APMDD for organizing this webinar, webinar. Greeting from Indonesia. Good day, everyone, and hopefully we are keep healthy and stay safe in the middle of the pandemic. Thank you for this opportunity. We would like to share the situation in Indonesia, and I saw in the participant also some friends from Indonesia also joined, so they I think they can also give a more information about the situation in Indonesia. So I will share my presentation. Okay, I will try to quick present. Okay, so you can see my presentation, everyone.
Can you press the presentation mode?
Okay, I will try.
Okay, to make it bigger.
Yes. Okay. So
Okay,
now?
Yes, there you go. Perfect.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. This is our presentation, my presentation. So why we call the debt issue is also the feminist issue, because I'm working with the organization and also we see how this is impact for the women and also the marginalized groups. And yeah, this is the Indonesia current debt position. So per June 2021, we see that our government released now our debt, yeah, around in the USD, we see the 551 trillions. So we can see how the bigger our debt now, and the composition is 12%. 12.86% is a loan from the domestic and also the foreign, and also the government securities higher than the loan, yeah, around 87%. So this is now the situation, and the debt increase for the response of the COVID. So in the middle of the COVID, in the middle of the pandemic, our government, there I don't know, take the opportunity to get the more loan from the international finance institution. So it's like the World Bank, ADB, AIIB, and also the Islamic Development Bank. So around May to 2020 until June 2021, the total of the loan from the IFIs around 3,712 million USD. So we can see how the huge debt now in Indonesia. And we see that because the pandemic is a part of the disaster in terms of our government. So we see how the polarization of the IFI in the disaster in Indonesia. So why we call the disaster capitalism, because the cycle we see in the sum of their response about the disaster in Indonesia, we see the similar polarization. So they give the grant in the first, and then the technical assistant to give some recommendation what the governments can do it, and then they open the opportunity to our government to get or to request some loan from them, yeah, and they give the consultant, and also how they are involved the private sector wider. So why we call this is a part of the cycle of the disaster capitalism. And now, of course, we see the impact for the people. It's not for the past of the project, but also for the future. So now, yeah, currently every resident in Indonesia bear the debt burden of the 23 million rupiah, or 1,500 US dollar. And of course, this can what is the open opportunity for the control of natural resources by the owner of the capital. And we can see in the major the project of by loan, yeah, they they use what is the approach, yeah, like land grabbing, and can make impact for the loss of the shelter, livelihood, crisis of water, pollution, forced displacement, etc. And also this is the polarized of the loan project is the involvement of the private sector is getting wider, and some they playing in the public sphere, education, health, water, yeah, and the other we can see how the governments, because this is the loan from the IFI so huge, and how the IFI intervention in our regulation. So our government, they do the deregulation, and that project can increase, yeah. And the other situation Yeah, this inline the strengthening of the militarism for security of investment. We can see now how the increased criminalization, how the increased intimidation, yeah, and also the anti-democracy for the people who fight for their life, for their livelihood, yeah, because the project by loan. And why my presentation about that issue is a feminist issue, because we see that the in the project loan by loan, we see the women's and men have the different impact. Of course, this is aligned because the gender roles for the women in society, because now the patriarchal system still in here, yeah, and we see how the project can impact the depression and workload will increase and be layered by because of the burden of meeting the families living and food needs. And we also see this is impact the elimination of the women's local knowledge and wisdom, uh, and the marginalization of the women's access and control over source of life and livelihood. And this is also the inline increasing violence against women, even the physical, psychological, economic, and sexual. So you can see in the number of the case, the data of the case violence against women in Indonesia. This is the data from the National Commission against women's violence against women. So this is the data to 2019, yeah, 431,000 case, and this is the increase than last year. So of course we see this is also what is have the link it with the increase the debt in Indonesia. And the other impact, we can also see access to public service and food are very limited. So actually, we conduct the FPAR, Feminist Participatory Action Research, last year in Kedung Ombo, hydropower and what is water reservoir in the central Java, that the project funded by the World Bank and Japan Exim. And after 36 years, we found that the women still have the problems. Their situation it's like they're difficult to access the public services, walk far away to access the market. They have the problem to access the water and also the education and also the food, because now they're moving in the other place. There's a very what is very difficult access to the water. So because the water are very close with the women's work, yeah, because the gender roles. So this is also make the impact, yeah, and increase the unpaid care work. And the all we can see this is what is contribute for the impoverishment of the women now in Indonesia. So we can see how the project funded by loan, yeah, and also the what is of loan for the changes our system, our law. This is also contribute to open what is the private sector to grab our sovereignty, our life, our livelihood. So this is the what is the our my overview for the presentation. Hopefully, we can discuss more about this. Thank you, Mai. give it to you again.
Thank you very much, Dewi. And this is, I really want to stress this now that as in any other crisis, it's really the discriminated groups, and you don't even call women a group because they're, half of the world's population. And when crisis hits, the impacts are much worse for them. So there we just highlighted the gender dimensions of the debt issue and relating that also to policy conditionalities such as water privatization, which I think up to 80% of women depend on, no, for water for their activities. And if you make that difficult for them to access, if you make that more expensive, then it's going to really increase their time poverty or really increase their unpaid care work. So thank you very much, Dewi. Now we move on to another Southeast Asian country, my country as well. So can we hear from Dr. Rene of Freneo? He's the president of the Freedom from Debt Coalition, which is based in the Philippines. FDC is one of the longest running economic policy advocacy alliances. And it continues to fight for the cancellation of illegitimate debts, as well as tax, fiscal, and climate justice. So, Karene,
Okay.
you have 15 minutes. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you are. FDC is a senior citizen among the debt advocates or debt activists. I have a very short presentation, not so long. So let me share. I'm just I will be discussing some lessons and ways forward regarding the debt issue in the Philippines, many of which were already discussed or were tackled or touched, by the way, by Lidy. Now, let me start by saying that the debt issue is has a fairly long history in the Philippines. Very quickly, we went to the IMF hospital in 1962, and we never left that hospital. And at the time, the purpose was to get a standby loan, or what they call as a stabilization loan. And it was followed by a series of standby loans. The policy conditionalities at the time, the Philippine economy was a bit restrictive in order to promote local industry. So American business was very unhappy. So they lobbied for the control. They call it the control, so that they can remit earnings to America. And of course, the standby loan was also accompanied by fiscal austerity, mainly in the form of and then also devaluation and a halt to Philippine industrialization drive. I don't know if those people were as old as me in the 1960s. The Philippines was already pursuing Filipino first, but it was stopped by this program. In 1970s, President Marcos declared martial law, and this paved the way for the entry of the World Bank. So first you have the IMF, now the World Bank. And the Philippines declared the Philippines as the World Bank declared the Philippines as an area of concentration. How? By introducing the concept of financing development, or is a nice term, but it's mainly realized through loans to targeted social physical infrastructures, including in the 1970s, the Green Revolution and rise. Now, policy conditionalities, abandonment of Philippine industrialization, blueprint passed by Congress, because in 1972 we had Philippine Congress, through the initiative of Speaker Laurel, adopted a Philippine industrialization blueprint. This was set aside, and instead, NEDA was created, headed by Western-educated technocrats. And then they started promoting a new development strategy that is not exactly pro-Filipino. They call it simply labor-intensive, export-oriented industrial strategy. And then in the 1980s, in the early 80s, you have this debt crisis, a recession in 1982 to 83, blossoming into a depression up to 1985 and 86. And so what happened? The IMF World Bank posed as the saviors of the economy, and then but they imposed a program of structural adjustment program. So we were the guinea pig in Asia of this new program called the Structural Adjustment Program, which was similarly implemented in Latin America. We were the Latin American country in Asia. So the Structural Adjustment Program consists of, you have trade liberalization, foreign investment liberalization, privatization, plus austerity. And of course, they succeeded in securing a commitment for a very popular government, a commitment for the Aquino government to honor in its entirety the debt legacy left by the Marcos regime. It's terrible. Then what's happening? Well, what's really happening is that the war for just that policy advocacy is a war for in the search for the right development framework. In the 1960s and 1970s, as you know, the IMF World Bank used political power, U.S. embassy lobby, support to martial law, to promote their narrow concept of development finance, economic openness through this labor-intensive, export-oriented program, and reinforced with the appointment of Western-educated technocrats supportive of IMF World Bank. To a certain extent, there was really some kind of alliance between the Marcos regime and the IMF World Bank. In the 1980s and up to 2000, 3 decades, the IMF and the World Bank, they waltz, they dance with the Aquino government, Ramos government, Estrada government, Arroyo government. And yet, in all this administration, the neoliberal technocrats managed to stay at the helm of economic policy management. They're very politically astute. Thus, in later years, you see, in the 1970s and 1980s, the IMF and World Bank, they would impose their policy conditionalities through what they call as letters of intent or memorandum of agreement. But now, with the neoliberal technocrats, they don't have to do that because the economic managers in Malacanang share the same perspective as the lenders. It is incest relations between, the negotiation is among themselves. Then this IMF, World Bank, and then also with the ADB, they use the weakened economy to further intensify the implementation of this structural adjustment program. And then at the turn of the millennium, the big push then was increasingly more on privatization. After all, in the 1990s, they have already liberalized the foreign investment regime. And so in the turn of the millennium, you have this all-out privatization of the energy sector. I think it's the biggest privatization program in Asia. In terms of sectoral impact. And then institutionalization of public-private partnership as the modality in building roads, bridges, dams, etc. So, and they came up with different acronyms for this PPP. Then, but what's really happening To a certain extent, there was growth at the turn of the millennium up to the present. And in fact, they're saying that the Philippines is under, well, during the latter part of the Arroyo administration, and then later on Aquino, and now Duterte, is Philippines one of the Asia's star performers. But the reality is that this stability, this growth in the economy was not due to the policy of structural adjustment posed by the IMF World Bank. The saviors really are the overseas Filipino workers. In 1975, while their export-oriented program had not taken off, the government, through the Department of Labor, said that in the meantime, while our export-oriented policy has not yet taken off, let us export manpower to the Middle East with their petrodollars, 50,000 in 1975. But this temporary program of manpower export became permanently temporary. And then today we have over 10 million overseas workers. That's equivalent to 10% of the resident population in the country. And so that is the savior of the economy. And so, but just the same, despite this, the reality is that our economy is really maldeveloped. It is jobless, and that's why you have this continuing exodus or diaspora. It's unequal. You see it everywhere, and it's futureless. And this was also again mentioned by Lidy. Environment is usually sacrificed, and there are some studies showing that while we were pursuing all this IMF World Bank program, the harvesting of the natural resources was done left and right by the cronies of whatever government sits in Malacanang. And hence, the paradigm from the coalition has been pushing for policy alternative, questioning privatization of power sector, questioning the law on automatic debt service, legacy of Marcos that continues by Cory, questioning odious debts with no benefits by the country, mentioned already by Lidy, ill-contracted debts and so on, missing or zero government support to social protection and basic services by the masses, continue. And FDC has also been advancing alternative debt program, alternative development strategy, one that is inclusive, balanced, grassroots-based, climate change ready, spelling out the role of the people in mitigation, adaptation, and resiliency building, and energized by solidarity spirit among the people's economy. We launched this in 2019, but for quite a long time, the FDC officers and activists have been discussing this way back then. So, as I said, the battle really is a battle of development framework. Now, and then in 2020, something happened. COVID-19 uninvited came and wrote havoc everywhere. So again, it flattened the economy. Then all of a sudden, our debt to GDP ratio, they claim in 2007, 2008, we have formally exited from IMF supervision, and that debt is no longer an issue. The debt to GDP ratio is 39%. After 3 decades of backbreaking debt servicing, and in 2019, they were announcing we are now Philippines soon to join the upper middle income developing countries, and we're about to get out of what they call as middle income trap. But after 1.5 years of COVID and borrowing, is now over 60%. The debt crisis is back. And we agree with Senator Drilon that whoever becomes president next year will have to tackle this debt problem. How can we survive? Now, because the government incompetent and lacking vision, simply imposes order by a top-down lockdown measures in managing the COVID situation. While the technocrats keep just simply push for, you see, the response of the technocrats to the crisis is simply push for neoliberal solutions like more trade and investment liberalization. And this was mentioned in the President's SONA. This at a time when the world is doing global distancing. And UNCTAD already mentioned last year that foreign investment flows will bound to decline. And then another solution, more privatization. Again, at the time when the pandemic really requires more direct government intervention in the market to assist the poor and save whole society. But the situation today is not as simple as before. The situation is further complicated by the entry of Chinese lenders. The supposed knights in shining armor for the Duterte administration. So the question to us is, how do we move forward? And this is a question that we keep grappling, discussing. We believe COVID-19 amplified the structures of maldevelopment. Country now facing multifaceted crises or multiple pandemics. We have the four horsemen: debt, COVID, inequality, and climate. They all need to be addressed in a coherent and integrated manner. And that's why we are now trying to, in this context, update the people's economy that we adopted in 2019. But there are other doables that we need to address. Aside from the people's economy updating and advocacy, we need to challenge government on immediate survival issues now, where what the people need is some assistance to ease a hunger. You have this joblessness, so you need to address social protection and social remuneration. Relatedly, we are also pushing for alternative people's stimulus, different from the stimulus of the technocrats who are simply saying we have to go back to the old normal, but the old normal is bad. So spending on social welfare, infra development, we are saying that people's stimulus need, government should spend more on social welfare toward the masses, infra development for urban, rural poor, and then infra development used for climate proofing, COVID proofing, with the unemployed given hiring preference. So we have to tweak these big ticket infra projects of the government in support of the infra for the poor communities. Financing, we are also pushing for tax on wealth and tweaking of the, so we have all these ideas being proposed. We are also questioning the tendency of government to slide to, I mentioned this already, to the default policy. Just open up, as if it will magically create jobs and growth for all of us. It is not. So other doables, well, we have to study. This is a continuing task that we are doing. The complexity of the debt situation today, given the changes brought about by the COVID situation, the international financial institutions, especially the IMF, they have been making adjustments also. They just came up with this move to release more money through the SDR, special drawing rights, increasing reliance of government on borrowing from private. So we are borrowing majority of our loans, national debt, are owed to private domestic lenders. So what's the meaning of this? We need to strengthen our ranks. After 4 decades of calling for debt-free development, some partners of FDC tend to have debt-free advocacy fatigue. But we try to counter this with advocacy for alternatives, like chapters have become more active, especially if there are clear doables at the community level, because this issue of development is at all, should be fought at all levels, at the community, local, national, regional, and global. With the debt crisis hugging headlines, FDC should be more articulate in raising issues on debt fairness, and then also how to tackle the policies of the IFI. We need to develop skills and know-how on how to mobilize more effectively the people on alternative, people's economy, people's stimulus, and so on. But to be able to do all of the above, we also need to forge people solidarity at home and globally. Now, the agenda for all, and we share the sentiments raised by Lidy, we should all work together in building a debt-free and just world. Let me conclude. Venceremos, we shall overcome. Thank you.
Maraming salamat, Karine. Thank you very much. So from Karine's side, he pointed out how the Philippines is, bragging around about its growth rates, but this really jobless growth. And for all the loan conditionalities that have firmly embedded neoliberalism in our country, it's very clear that this myth that neoliberalism will lift all boats has been exposed. It does not lift all boats, and some of those people there in that big wide ocean do not even have boats. No, they're drowning. So at this point, perhaps we need a short break. So just to be energized by so many participants that we have, can we kindly request everyone to open their cameras so that we can take a group photo? This will only take a few seconds. And then after that, we will go to South Asia, where we have our leaders from India and Pakistan. So are we all ready? So Bruce or Mikay, can you just give the signal, please?
Okay.
Just waiting for the others to turn on their cameras.
Okay.
But
So
it's up to you if you
yeah.
some of
So
us made.
we put in the chat that it's really up to you if you want to open or not. So those who are willing, please do, and then we can take a group photo. So maybe we can start taking the screenshots now.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Another one for the next slide. And last one. 3, 2, 1. There you go. It's done.
That, okay, thank you. And Joki messaged that her camera is not working. Don't worry, and Joki, we will put an image of Njoki in the final photo wall if we put out a photo wall. So moving on, I'd like to call on our next speaker. He's managing trustee of Environics Trust, which is an organization based in India, pursuing innovative solutions to community development problems, solutions that respond to the diversity and complexity of specific ecosystems and socio-political cultural environments. So Sridhar, may I call on Sridhar? He's here
Yeah,
in
thank you,
the,
May.
yeah, okay. So thank you very much, Sridhar. You have 15 minutes, around 50 minutes. So would you like to share your screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Um, Thank you, May, and thank you, Lidy, Pushpa, and Professor Reno for very erudite presentations. And uh, going by what initially Mai said about this meeting, looking forward to a framework, and also the fact that what Lidy and Professor pointed out, and as example Pushpa mentioned, uh, who owes whom is probably the biggest question that we need to address now, because The situation in India or no, most of our countries is more or less same, given the fact that India is a much larger population and a bigger economy. Our debt and the debt disease is only a more stronger problem. But what I would like to do is share with you a small video of which presents in contrast a large public sector aluminum company, which was the cause for the initial debts in Orissa, in the tribal areas, and how tribals themselves set up a small micro hydro and presenting it in the manner that uh, the uh, the basic question that we are asking, who owes whom.
Yeah, 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 la jogo dor जिम्मेदारी दलो ये चोरता निवा ये चोरता मम्मा ये चोरता तू रोदा तो मैं दल्ला ये चोरदान गुरु ने दल्ला ये चोरता निवा ये चोर बारा ये चोरता मनवा ये चोर रोई में दल्ला ये चोरता निवा ये चोरता तो रोदा तो मैं दल्ला ये चोरता मनवा चात गोदार कान्या तो चा गोदार माता तो ने दल्ला ये चोरता मनवा ये चोर पेंदा तो ने चोर कोला कांजी ये चोरता निम्मा ने चोरा ने दल्ला ईश्वर से मनवा ये चोरता तो रेता ने दल्ला ये चोरता निवा ये चोरदार गुरु ने दल्ला ये चोरता निवा ये चोर रोई में दल्ला ये चोर ये चोरता निवा ये चोर कोल्हापुर जिले ते दल्ला ये चोरता मनवा ये चोर राजूर के दल्ला ये चोरता निवा ये चोर डेपोर रोई में चोर कांकी के डेपोर मांटे के डेपोर रोई में दल्ला ये चोर ये चोरता तारता बेयान मत के नूर रोई में दल्ला ये चोरता निवा ये चोर बेना मनता ये दल्ला ये चोरता निवा जो इंदु बाटे यल्बा बाटे तंगा बाटे योरिया बाटे मनवा ये चोर चेंगे मनवा ये चोर गुरु ये दला ये चोर पोते पैसो डाइला पैसो मनवा ये चोर चेंगे मनवा डेपो रोइमो ये दे कांका डेपो रोइमो मंटा डेपो रोइम ये दे ये चोनी बास तो करगुंडा जिम्मे कसल कयो गंबरा दिन मनवा तो लंबोइसुम ये चोर चेंगे मलगन गिरे मालिन मनवा ये चोने चोरन्नुम ये दला ये चोर धर्मो गुरु नु कुमे चोरइमो ये देवे ना कांका बात के मंट बात के दांको डेपोरइम ये चो नंद राजू बाबू नेला रेंडो गिरियो पालो मनवाम ये चोर मन्ने गुंडा बालो राजिन कन्ना राजिन पोता राजिनो कुम ये चोर अर्रो गेल्ले पिल्ला तल्लुर मनवा ये चो निवाडे पोरोइम ये चोर बेजिंग वाड़ा ये चोर यायो मनवा धर्मो गुरु ने चोरोइमु बापे यो केल्दुर चोरोइम ये दला ये चोर बेना राजुर बाता ये दे गालिना विश्रोर मंटा ते दुर्वादा ये दे ये सोनी वा ये चोर कांका डेपा मंडा डेपा ये चोर मनवा यो कुम मन्नो मानम
এটা অল্প দিনিয়া আন্দোলন বলিকি ভাবি নেওয়া পড়ব না এই আন্দোলনটা সারা জীবন পাই রহব কাইকি না আজি তো এ সংগঠনটা আন্দোলনটা চালিছি কালি কি আম পুଅ নাতি পাই বি এই আন্দোলনটা চালিথিব যেমতি যে গোটে চাষী যেমতি অমল করুচি ক্ষেতরে যেমতি পৌঁছুচি ক্ষেত সরলা পর্যন্ত জগুচি সেটা হি আমার এই গোটে কণি কদান যেতে দিন পর্যন্ত আম কাশীপুর ব্লকরে থিব বা ইয়ে আমার ভারতের যেতে দিন পর্যন্ত রইথিব ସେଦିନ ପର୍ଯ୍ୟନ୍ତ ଏ ଆନ୍ଦୋଳନଟା ଜାରି ରହିବ।
ସେଥିପାଇଁ ବୋଲି ଆଜି ଆମର ଯେଉଁ ଭାରତ ଭିତରେ ଯେତିକି ଯେଉଁ ଆମର ଜନସାଧାରଣ ମାନଙ୍କୁ ଉପରେ ପ୍ରଭାବ ପଡ଼ୁଛି ସେଥିପାଇଁ ଆମର କିଏ ଦାୟୀ?
ଏନେ ତେନେ ତେନେ ଶୋଇଥିଲା କାହିଁଟା ଦେଇ ଆଇଛୁ ମା କାହିଁଟା ଦେଇ ଆଇଛୁ ମା ବୋଲା କିଛି ଆମେ ଦେଇ ଆଇଛୁ ନାହିଁ ଆଜ୍ଞା ଆମେ ତୁମର ଜାଗା ଦେଖିବାକୁ ଆଇଛୁ ବୋଲି କହିଲୁ। ହଁ ଜାଗା ଦେଖିବାକୁ ଆଇଲୁ ଖାଇଲୁ କି ନାହିଁ ନାଇଁ ମୁଇଁ ଖାଇ ନାହିଁ ଚାଉଳ ଆଣି ନାହିଁ ତର୍ଣ୍ଣ ପାଣି ଆଣିଲେ ସିନା କନକ ଖାଇଲୁ ପୁନି ଆମେ କିଛି ଖାଇ ନାହିଁ ବୋଲାକେ ଆମର ଆଖିର ରସ ବାରିଗଲା। ହଁ ସେ ବୁଢ଼ାକେ ଦେଖିକରି ଆଉ କାନ୍ଦିଲା କେ ହଁ ହଁ କୁଡ଼ିଆ ମାନେ ଏତେ 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 କମ୍ପାନୀ ବାନ୍ଧି ଦେଇଛେ ସେ ଡଙ୍ଗରରେ ସେ ଟିକରାରେ ପାଣି ନଇଲା ଜାଗା କାଠି ନଇଲା ଜାଗା ବାନ୍ଧି ଦେଇଛେ ସେ ଦାମ ଜଳି ଏ ବାପା ଏମିତି ହିନସ୍ତା
କାହିଁ ତ କାମ ଦାମ କଲୁନି ଘରେ ଏକାଛୁ ଜମି ବାଡ଼ିଟା ସବୁ ମାଟି ବାଡ଼ି ତା ସବୁ ଜମି ବାଡ଼ିଟା ସବୁ ନାଲକୁ ନେଲା ଏଠି କାହିଁ ଜମି ଅଛି କି ବାଡ଼ି ତା ସବୁ ତାସ ମାଣ୍ଡିଆ ପାତାବି ତା କିଛି ନାହିଁ।
ସେଥିପାଇଁ ଆମେ ଜମିବାଡ଼ି ଯଦି ସର୍ବହରା ହେଇ ଆମେ ଦାଣ୍ଡର ଭିକାରୀ ହେଇକି ବୁଲିବୁ। ଏଥିପାଇଁ ଆମେ ମାଇନ୍ସ ଚାହୁଁନୁ। ଏ ଯେଉଁ ମାଇନ୍ସଟା ଯଦି ଉତ୍ତୋଳନ କରାଯାଏ ଆମର ଲୋକଙ୍କର ତ କୌଣସି ଫାଇଦା ନୁହଁ ଏଇଟା ସରକାରଙ୍କର ଫାଇଦା କି ବଡ଼ ବଡ଼ ମାଲିକଙ୍କର ଫାଇଦା କି ଏଇ ଯେଉଁ ସାହୁକାରଙ୍କର ଫାଇଦା ଏଇଟା ଆମର ଦୁଃଖୀ ଦରିଦ୍ର ଏ ଗରିବ ଆଦିବାସୀ ଦଳିତମାନଙ୍କୁ କୌଣସି ଫାଇଦା ନାହିଁ।
ସୂର୍ଯ୍ୟ ହିରଣ ଜାତ ଜନ୍ମ ହେଲା ସେଦିନେ ଭଗବାନ ସୃଷ୍ଟି କରାଯାଇଛି ଏ ଜଳକୁ ଜମିକୁ ଜଙ୍ଗଲକୁ ପଥର ପବନ ଏତିକିକୁ ଭଗବାନ ସୃଷ୍ଟି କରା ଦିଆଯାଇଛି। ସେ ଜଳକୁ ସେ ଜମିକୁ ଜଙ୍ଗଲକୁ କୌଣସି ଲୋକ ଆମକୁ ତିଆରି କରି ଦେଇପାରିବେ ନାହିଁ।
ଜାଗା ବନାଇଲେ ଆମେ ବହୁତ ସୁବିଧାରେ ବଞ୍ଚିଛି ସେ ଲୋକ ବଡ଼ ବଡ଼ ପାଠ ପଢ଼ିଲା ଲୋକ ଶିକ୍ଷିତ ଲୋକ ଅଶିକ୍ଷିତ ଦେଶେ ଆସିକରି କେମିତି ନାଇଁରେ ବାବୁ ତୁମକୁ ଆମେ ପାଠ ପଢ଼ାଇବୁ ଆଉ ତୁମକୁ ଚାକିରି ଦେବୁ ଆରାମସେ ଆମର ବଲିଆ ପ୍ୟାଣ୍ଟ ପିନ୍ଧିବୁ ଆରାମସେ ଆମର ବଲିଆ ଚେୟାର ଲଗେ ବସବୁ ତୁମକେ କିଛି ଚିନ୍ତା କର ନାହିଁ ତୁମେ କେତେ ଏକର ଲେଖା ବେଳକୁ ଟିକେ ଆମକୁ ଜମି ଦିଅ ବୋଲି ଆମକୁ ବାବୁ ସେମିତି ଉଲୁ କରିଦେଇ ଆସିକରି କେମିତି କଲାଏ ସବୁ ମନ କଲା ଫ୍ୟାକ୍ଟରୀ ମନ ବସାଇଲା ଫ୍ୟାକ୍ଟରୀ ମନ ବସାଇଲା କି ଆମର ଜମି ବି ନଷ୍ଟ ହୋଇଗଲା ଆମର ଜଙ୍ଗଲ ବି ନଷ୍ଟ ହୋଇଗଲା ଆମର ଜୀବନ ବି ନଷ୍ଟ ହୋଇଗଲା। ସେହି ପ୍ରକାର ଯଦି ଆମେ ସେ ବାବୁ ମନର ପାରା ଆମେ ଯଦି ଅଲପ ଭାଟ ପଡ଼ି ରହିଲେ ଆମେ ମିଶ ଅଲପ ଯଦି ଟିକେ ଶିଖି ରହିଲେ ନାଇଁ ବାବୁ ଆମେ ଦେବୁ ନାହିଁ ଯାଅ ତୁମର ବାଟେ ତୁମେ ରୁଆ ଆମର ଜାଗା ଦେବୁ ନାହିଁ ଆମର ମାଟି ଦେବୁ ନାହିଁ ଆମର ନଦୀ ଦେବୁ ନାହିଁ ଆମର ଜଙ୍ଗଲ ଦେବୁ ନାହିଁ ବୋଲି କହିଲେ ସେ ଲୋକରେ ପୋଷି ପାରତାଇ ନାହିଁ ପୋଷି ପାରତାଇ ନାହିଁ ଆମେ ଅଶିକ୍ଷିତ ଲୋକ ବଡ଼େ ଡରୁଆ ଲୋକ ଏ ଲୋକ ସତକାଇକି ତାକର ପାରା ଶିଖବାର ହୋଇଛି ତାକର ପାରା ଜାନବାର ହୋଇଛି ଏ ଲୋକ ପୁଣି ଆମକେ ଶିଖାଇବାଏ ଏ ଲୋକ ପୁଣି ଆମକେ ପୁଣି ଚାକିରି ଦେବାଏ ବୋଲି ଆମେ ଉଲୁ ହୋଇଗଲୁ ନହେଲେ ଏ ପ୍ରକାର ଏବେ ଆମର ବାସଦେବ ଭାଇମାନ କେମିତି ଶିକ୍ଷିତ ହେଲାଏ ସେ ପ୍ରକାର ଯଦି ଆମେ ଶିକ୍ଷିତ ହୋଇ ରହିଲେ ସେ ଲୋକକେ ଚୁଞ୍ଚି ମୁନା ଏଡ଼େ କ'ଣ ଆମେ ଦେଇପାରତୁ ନାହିଁ।
So essentially what this film is trying to tell us is who owes whom. It's a huge debt that the financial debtors owe, creditors of ours owe to us. And possibly we should have a huge number of examples to be able to show these people that uh, they are the actual debtors and they need to pay up and pay up urgently in the context of climate change, in the context of the increasing inequalities between the rich and the poor. In the context of India, we find that the top 5 corporates cumulatively gained over 1.3 trillion during this COVID, whereas at least 15 to 20% of those who were formally employed have lost their formal employment. And now we are hearing that given the kind of crisis and lockdowns, maybe there will be more mechanization, more robotics that will be brought into play with what Professor Reno also pointed out, the continuing jobless growth. And so the corrupt governments in the southern nations must be told that the debts that they are taking on our name. For instance, if you look at the kind of loan that India has taken on COVID, the interesting part is it allows for such a indiscriminate use that 40% of the money that was given in June last year says that it could have 40% of the expenses could be shown even for the pre-COVID periods. So with several multilateral banks and private equity funds competing to lend to countries and different kind of entities within the country, the debt problem will worsen unless we reverse this trend and argue for paying back our what is owed to people, the poor people, currently the poor people who had been rich in the past and can recreate their past in a very interesting way. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sridhar. So Sridhar really touched on what Lidy also mentioned earlier, that what is being claimed from us is very, very small in comparison to the way that our resources have been ravaged and destroyed over so many years, no, centuries even. And now we have this a huge ecological debt that the North owes the South, of which climate debt is a part of that. So mining, no, we are targeted as resource-rich countries by mining. And this is a sector dominated by really just a few multinational corporations. And it has caused irreparable damage. It has also threatened the future of generations yet to come. So this is part of that huge debt, a debt that is incalculable because of it's now impossible to pay that because so much has been destroyed and cannot be brought back, and also causing all the vulnerabilities we have right now to climate and to other crises. So finally, I'm very happy to call on our colleague from the Pakistan Kisan Rabita Committee. Is the General Secretary. Welcome, Farouk Tariq. You have the floor, Farouk.
And I thank you, Suridhar, for showing this video. This is the same story we have in Pakistan. Lands have been grabbed, peasants have been thrown out, false promises made, and never implemented those promises which were made during taking over their land for so-called development projects. Like near Lahore, they want to build a new city, a city on 100,000 acre of land. But this is like a project to occupy land of the peasants and not to give land to ordinary people who build their home and they need in desperation a lot of residents. So thank you APMDD for organizing this webinar. I would take up the issue of Pakistan and also give some basic figures of Pakistan debt and the government attitude towards the debt. Now, there are two areas which are no-go areas. You can't speak about them publicly. You could be anti-state element if you talk about them. One of them is foreign debts, and second is the defense budget. And because they are stopping us from the two most allocated, funded area of our national budget. And that is where the whole, that is where our poverty is hidden. That's where they are bringing famine-like situation to many areas in Pakistan. So I would like to say that we will talk about foreign debt. We will talk about how much the government is paying and why they are paying and where the money has been spent. And we will demand the audit, the social audit of our debt. There is no other way that we can get rid of our poverty, and we should not speak about our foreign debt. Now, at this time, there is around 116 billion total foreign debt of Pakistan, which accounts nearly 36% of the total budget. And this is accounting almost 87% of our GDP, not just 60%, which is normally accepted that you should have a foreign debt around 60% of our GDP, but it has exceeded to that limit and touching now nearly 100%, 87% at present time. And during this year, Pakistani government has paid almost $11 billion back to these multinational financial institutions and countries. And this is almost 25% more than the last year. So during COVID, when you could say easily, we don't pay, we don't have the money, we have to spend on our people. People are dying, there is no jobs, factories are closed, institutions are closed, there's a strict lockdown. So we have to give them some money to survive on. But that is not been done. Instead, they brought an employee of World Bank on the post of finance ministry. He is now gone, but 2.5 years he was Pakistan finance minister, and his main job was to increase the prices of the area where most of the people are using, like electricity, like gas, like oil. So all the prices of these things were increased on the demand of IMF, where they were having the loan. And almost in 3 years, the electricity has gone 3 times more than it was in beginning 2018. And people are really fed up of paying bills of electricity and gas. These are the two areas always increasing. And what we are told, Pakistan is the cheapest country in the South Asia. They say, imagine how expensive it is in the other areas. We say, if you want to imagine, if you want to compare Pakistan's prices, then also compare the income of the people. Also take care how much Pakistani working class is increasing. This is only 20,000 minimum wage, and even 80% of the institutions are not paying that minimum wage to the working class in Pakistan. And this is the condition where they are trying to tell us India is more expensive, Sri Lanka is more expensive, and so on. But compare where they don't compare how much they are paying as foreign debt. Now, I also like to say that Pakistan availed G20, this debt servicing suspension initiative, which is around $3.7 billion. and also, but where that money has gone? As Sridhar asked, who owes who? And that was the title of a book written by Iratusa in the 90s on this question, who owes who? Your money or your life? He also wrote that book at the time. So we know who owes who. We don't owe. Those who owe are not paying back because they took the money, they should pay, not us, not ordinary people. So it's not the rich who are paying the debt, it is the ordinary people who are paying the debt. And that is a general position we have seen in all of the South Asian countries. Now, Liddy has spoken very well about what to do and what demands. Now, we are sometimes told you are demanding cancellation of debt, and you are demanding cancellation for whom? Because many people say, yes, if they don't pay, they will not spend on the people's welfare. So our demand for cancellation is very conditional. It's not straightforward cancel the debt and the bloody rich could enjoy their life more than what they have at present time. Our demand for cancellation of debt are totally linked of spending that money on social welfare, on people's health, on free vaccines for all, on educational system, free education for all, on residence, on transport. So the immediate need of the people, that is where we are demanding cancellation of debt. But we are not just asking the Western world to give, to be more charitable to our ruling class and don't ask money from them. No, the Pakistani, and we demand that they should not pay the debt, and we are demanding to the rich countries they should not demand these debt at this particular time of COVID. Now, COVID have taken a toll very seriously all over, also in Pakistan. Over 20 million have gone back to poverty, which were taken out at one time. We have seen that people during the lockdown had nothing to eat. I can tell you the example of Malaysia at this time, where Pakistani migrant community, whose many of them are so-called illegal, they don't have the paper, and these migrant workers without papers have nothing to eat. And they send SOS messages to all of us to help them. And that is the condition of migrant labor. And we can see the same condition of migrant labor in all South Asian countries. And governments consider those so-called illegal workers, they are not in their books, they are not in state any beneficiary schemes, so they are just left out. And we don't say anyone is illegal, we say they are without papers. Give them the papers to stay and work, give them a life worth spending rather than pushing them out of the country and pushing them more in poverty. So I would say that we all agree the demands which Lidy has presented here, cancellation of debt with our conditions, and we will continue our campaign for the cancellation of debt in all the South Asian countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Farouk. So Pakistan has some of the one biggest debt problems right now, and it's occupying the headlines as nearing default, sovereign default. So again, this is from the framework that the creditors are fearful that they will not be paid, but they are not looking at the actual conditions that people are going through in order that governments can make their debt service payments, because such is the way of countries that have become so dependent on debt that when the debt stop, then it's a huge problem, no? Because you become so entrapped, so dependent on debt that you're not able to raise financially on your own. So thank you very much to all our speakers, and we hope that everyone has gained some sense of what's happening regionally. Of course, it's very limited given our time, but we'll have more of these later. So we'd like to open the floor now if there are any questions or comments on the input so far. I see a lot of debt groups and debt movements. So I take this as a very good sign that our interest has remained alive. That the debt justice movement has never really disappeared, but now we are called, challenged by the times to address this strongly again. I think there's something in the chat. Okay. No questions. Just congratulatory messages to our speakers for the great presentations. And yeah, so thank you very much for that. They were very clear presentations and really, affirming of our principles and perspectives. So I guess I just want to draw attention on three things. I'm sure there are more major top line messages from this webinar, but at least the three that I thought really stood out. First is underlining the very sharp difference of perspectives. No, when you hear the IFIs, the World Bank, IMF talking about the debt problem, or you hear the OECD saying that all developing countries, they're having a hard time, and how can they pay? And if you add to that the debt service, then they're really in hot water. And so, sorry, I hope you do not hear the thunder. Okay, so it's really coming from a perspective it's like a business, no? The business of lending. So if you're a lender and somebody borrows from you and they cannot pay, that's a crisis for you. But we are taking the position, and we have taken this long before, and also as highlighted by Sridhar and Farouk, and including the gender dimension, that we look at debt in a much bigger expanse, no? Historical. So we have here the debts that have unfairly allowed the North to advance its economies while ravaging countries and leaving them without the resources necessary for their own development. So I remember in one webinar, Lidy raised the question, why is it that your offers of debt relief are very much emphasize how countries are going to pay? No? So this is really how debt is being used to enrich some more these countries that are lenders or creditors. It's really just a business that's very profitable. On our end, debt is an enslaving instrument, an instrument for domination that continues to this day. So we see that, second point, we see that in terms of very harsh impact. So these are not impacts that you only feel today or last week or last month. These are impacts that have been there before and continue. They add layer upon layer upon layer, and deepening the inequality and the poverty. So privatization, for example, you might look at that as just simple policy, but it's been shown to increase inequality and make access even more difficult for people who are already without the means in the first place. So we see this now playing out most tragically in the time of COVID. Within countries, the richer folk, tiny number, are able to survive much more than those who have no homes or are forced to live in close quarters, who have no access to adequate, clean, safe water. And then another thing of these enslaving conditions, that we need to stress, is that that has gone so deeply into our policies. Actually, these are policies that we had no say in making. So they are that has shaped policies along neoliberal ways, really embedding that profit-driven thinking, and also promoting the private sector as the savior of us all. So public money is actually put up so that to attract private sector investment. And then finally, we look at the past, but we know that this past has and is shaping our present. And if we do not change that, it will also determine or shape our future. So we see now that there's so many ways that they're offering to solve our debt problem, but we see this as ways in which countries are being pushed to borrow some more. And they don't even include countries like the Philippines and Indonesia, the middle income, because there's this assumption that middle income countries are not as heavily troubled. And still, you can see there that their interest is really that these countries, so-called middle income, they think can still pay the debt service. So that's the interest there. So I just want to highlight those things. And finally, we also see the instrumentalization of gender, gender equality, saying that, of course, women are deeply affected by the crisis and the multiple crises. But the solution is you need to borrow to address these needs. So that's instrumentalizing human rights, gender equality, and even climate. Okay, I'll just have one last look at the chat. And okay, Manj, would you like to speak? You can speak, I'm Manjet Lopez of San Lacas has a comment, and we still have a few more minutes to go. Okay, so I will first call on was that you, Max?
Yes, Max
Okay,
Babri.
so Max and then Manjet Lopez. Okay, Max, can you just and introduce
Yes,
yourself, please?
let me start with a little on the lighter side of things. So when somebody asks in Pakistan, I'm from Pakistan, but currently I'm in Sweden. So when in Pakistan, we ask, where is the capital of Pakistan? Then somebody responds, the capital of Pakistan is in the Swiss banks. So indication of that is that actually all the money borrowed by Pakistan and many of the developing countries has increased the corruption, and all this money has gone into the Western banks in the Western world, in the Northern world, as we call it, and they are in those banks. And as a result of that, the country and the poor people of such countries become even more indebted, while as the money has had nothing to show for it. Pakistan, for example, has had many millions of dollars, 190 millions of dollars in debt, but $190 million is a lot of money, and we don't see any of this money deployed into improving the quality of life of the majority of citizens of Pakistan. And I think that is the story in many of the other countries. So I think those people who have lent us money They must also be accountable for tracing where this money is and why it has not been spent on improving the quality of life of the citizen of those countries. And I think this must be the story in many of the countries who are now hugely indebted. So that is another argument that not only the one who has received the money is responsible, but also the people who gave this money are responsible not to follow it up and see to it that it actually transforms the world and improves quality of life. Interestingly, it is the richest countries of the world who are most indebted. People, countries which are richest in terms of manpower, in terms of natural resources, in terms of assets, and all these assets and all these natural resources have been exploited and has brought welfare and improved quality of life for the businessman and the capitalist in the developed countries, while the majority of people in the developing countries have become even more poor. So I rest my case here.
Okay, thank you, Max. Indeed, yeah. And then we're also saying that the debt is also composed of what has been taken away from our resources. So it's difficult to put a price tag on that when you've robbed countries or peoples of a present and a future. No, it's difficult. So Manj, you have a comment? Can you?
Yes, yes.
Yes, yeah.
I just wanted to comment when you were talking about perspectives. It's actually not just a matter of perspective, but of the actual position of certain countries in the world, no? Like, for example, the United States is actually the biggest debtor, no, in the entire world, no? They're into it, trillions and trillions of dollars, but they're not worried about it, not at all, no? Every time a more payment due comes around the corner, they just simply print more dollars, nah? Print more dollars, and that's it. And as of several years ago, they passed in their Congress that they call it quantitative easing. It's something they will do indefinitely for as long as necessary. So this is an example. They do so without any worries because of their exact position. I call it hegemonic position in terms of the controls over markets and a large part of the economies of the world, nah? Whether in trade or capital markets. And they bank on it. They bank on it. And the fact that much of debts incurred by different parts, no, different countries all over the world are in dollars. I'm not saying all of it, but much of. And that's it. It's they have a hegemonic. They continue to have a hegemonic position, no, in the world. And then I was thinking maybe it's something we should think about in terms of solutions of South countries vis-a-vis this borrowing and debt issues beyond payments or cancellation, in terms of something we can do together to outsmart this hegemonic power that is. Anyway, knowing that they're there now, knowing that they it's equivalent to me. It's equivalent to impunity, huh? To incur so much debt and not to worry about it, and just they simply print because it's the dollar. So for future studies, everybody, for our future discussions. That's all. Thank you.
Manj.
Congratulations,
Yeah.
congratulations, APMDD.
Yeah, very, very important point, because also Max mentioned that the richest countries are also the most indebted. And how do we look at that? So Manj raised that we need to look at how different countries and political interests are also differently positioned, that some can get away with it, impunity, and then while we who are also borrowers are, really hanging on to the brink of survival with almost a future that seems to be inevitably tied to borrowing. So we need to look at this particular particularity of the how the debt issue has evolved over the years now. So maybe we have one more time for one more, but Zaigum, I hope you that is brief because we are now going into our closing section. Okay, so go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Just a brief comment on the debt trajectory of Pakistan. It has not just become a very real burden on the economy, but also it has become a kind of vicious cycle. Because what we see in Pakistan is that there is just one certain institution which actually benefits from all these loans and debts that the country takes. And usually what happens is, and I can relate it to the experience of Philippines as well, because usually what happens here in Pakistan is that whenever there's a military government, there's a dictatorship, what they essentially do is they borrow a lot of foreign loans and money, and they try to give the impression that this money is being spent on people. And of course the statistics, they really do suggest some kind of growth in military dictatorships. And what essentially happens because of that is that people really have this impression that economic growth is only possible during a military regime or a dictatorship. And this perception actually leads to legitimizing dictatorial dictators and dictatorial governments in the popular Pakistani perception. And unfortunately, we have not been able to get rid of this perception. What essentially happens is that when the military dictators, they get these different loans and money, they are also dictated by these foreign powers, especially in the case of war on terror. Since 2001, Pakistan has been dictated on so many issues of national interest. And of course, after war on terror, there was the military-led government by General Pervez Musharraf. It was not just devastating for the economy, but also, it made so difficult decisions regarding national interest and national security issues. So what I see is that, and after every 10 years of brief hiatus of a nominally democratic system, these military dictators, they come again with the claim that, oh, you see, if you go back and look at the history, the only growth has been possible during military dictatorship. To give this pretense that military dictatorships are economy, because there's a lot of accountability in these institutions. So just to relate it to maybe our participants can also shed light on, do they have similar kind of experience in other countries like this, especially in terms of Philippines?
Okay, thank you. I think that was also mentioned that the illegitimate debts that were incurred by dictatorships is also part of the issues that we address now within countries now. So I know I'm breaking my own rules. So let's have the last one, Rovik. I hope you make it brief.
Yeah, thank you, May. Thank you, everyone. Sorry, I have a problem with my internet connection, so I won't be turning on my camera. I just want to stress that a major issue, of course, is the impact that rising debt has on government spending for public services. I don't know how much better or worse the situation is in your countries, but for example, in the Philippines for 2021, 40% of the national budget will go to debt servicing. That's close to half of government spending that won't be going to funding for healthcare, which we badly need during this time of pandemic, for education and other essential services that directly benefit the people and society. So it's not just a question of whether you have the money to pay off your debt, but also a question of whether that money can be better spent elsewhere, whether you're taking money away from other things which are more important.
Yeah, yeah. So precisely why we're also calling for cancellation as a way to free up public money for survival, no? For people's survival. So I'm afraid we have reached the last 2 minutes of our webinar, and I just need some time to invite everyone again to our session next week. That's session 2, where we'll go into a deeper dive into the debt landscape in our region and connecting that also with what's happening globally in terms of the solutions being offered, because this has taken a really important spot recently in the G7 and G20 agendas. So we're asking, how are we doing in terms of these funds being claimed from us, and what are we being asked to do, no? And have a critical look at that, critical perspectives into that, so that we are also capacitated in addressing the issues of debt as they come along from really grounded, rights-based and people-centered positioning on the debt issue. So with that, maraming salamat, as we say here in the Philippines. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you all again for our next session. Please feel free to write us on any questions that you want to raise in the next session, so that we can flag it with our speakers also. No? So we just monitor our communications, and we will inform you of the connection details and all that stuff. Okay. So bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.